Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Wake Up with Ashland, sponsored by Dupree Mutual Funds. My name is Cameron Walpole. I'm the manager of tours and education at Ashland, the Henry Clay Estate. Today, you're waking up with Ashland, but you're not waking up at Ashland. We're actually at the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Now, this is a fascinating National Historic Landmark. It's got a lot of incredible history, and it's got some great ties to the Clay family. So we're going to explore a little bit about those ties to the Clay family today. But I'm joined by a really special guest. I have the president of the Congressional Cemetery here, Paul Williams. Oh, also have another special guest joining us. This is not Paul Williams. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, how are you?
We're doing great. We want to just kind of get a good sense of what this place is. What is the Congressional Cemetery?
Sure. Despite our namesake being Congressional Cemetery, we are actually a cemetery for everybody, from presidents to residents alike. We were formed in 1807. We're about 18 blocks away from the U.S. Capitol building itself. And we're called Congressional Cemetery because we have about 160 congressmen, no women yet, buried here. The federal government bought about 160 sites. And if you died in office between 1807 and 1876, Congress gave you one of these things. It's called a cenotaph. And cenotaph refers to a Greek term meaning empty tomb. So you didn't have to be buried here. About a third of the people that had a cenotaph are buried here. It was usually before there was embalming and trains to get you back to your home state. But you got one of these. So the interesting thing is they are the same Aquia sandstone as the U.S. Capitol building, which is painted white, but it's actually this sandstone from Virginia.
Huh.
And they were designed by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the same individual that designed the Capitol building.
There's a really interesting connection even to Benjamin Henry Latrobe, which is that he designed the wings of Ashland, of Henry Clay's Ashland.
And he designed his tombstone.
And he also designed the cenotaph here,
Isn't that
so
cool?
it's pretty cool.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got two groupings of them. There's about 80 over here, and then on the hill near Laura Clay is another grouping of cenotaphs. So we're pretty proud of them. I think what's really interesting is you got one in succession as you went down the road when you died.
Oh.
So that's why John C. Calhoun is right next to Henry Clay.
So this is pretty cool, right? We've got at least two of the three of the great triumvirate right here. Mm-hmm. Honorable John C. Calhoun, and then the Honorable Henry Clay of Kentucky. So this is pretty fascinating. Now, can you tell us a little bit about some of the most famous people who are buried here at the cemetery?
Yeah, in addition to Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, at least we have their cenotaphs. Probably our most famous visited is J. Edgar Hoover, the infamous director of the FBI for many, many decades. We have the March King, John Philip Sousa. If you were ever in high school doing march music, you played his music. Our third one is Matthew Brady, the noted Civil War photographer, who's going to get a giant memorial pretty soon.
So
and
cool.
then we have our famous, infamous Mayor Barry, who's buried here as well. So we're still an active cemetery, despite being 116, 17 years old, with plots for sale.
That is fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about that. We would love to maybe walk a little bit closer to Laura's
Sure.
grave. Let's see. We're just about a couple miles away from the U.S. Capitol building, if that's correct, right?
Yep. 18 city blocks.
So Paul is nice enough to join me as we walk to Laura Clay's grave. And as we walk there, just kind of wanted to tell our visitors or viewers about Laura. So Henry and Lucretia Clay had a daughter named Laura Clay on October 16th, 1816. Henry Clay had been elected to Congress, and just about a little after a month after Laura was born, Henry and Lucretia made the journey to Washington, D.C. Oh, well, hello.
Hello.
And as part of this journey, which could have taken up to 3 weeks, traveling from Lexington, Kentucky to Washington, D.C., Laura developed whooping cough along the way. So only a month old. Can you imagine that when you're traveling in a carriage across the country with a 1-month-old? She developed whooping cough, and it seems that she died in December, just about 3 months old. Now there's conflicting records on when she died, but the tombstone says that she died in December, but Henry Clay's daughter-in-law Susan kept great family records, and she says that she died on January 17th, so that she made it to her 4th month. Now this is kind of, difficult to pinpoint exactly when she did die, but we have a really interesting letter that Henry Clay wrote to Thomas Morris of Ohio. We're getting kind of close, right? Right over here. Oh, sorry, excuse me. And I'm going to read a little bit about that letter when we get up to Laura's grave. Paul, would you mind telling us why there are so many dogs here?
We're a little unusual with the cemetery. We were abandoned in the 70s and the 80s and up until the 90s. And it was a group of local dog walkers that kind of self-taxed themselves to be able to mow the yard. We had weeds up to chest high for funerals, and that has developed now into a canine membership. You have to be a member. We have 800 dogs. They can run off leash. We're completely fenced, which is really rare for an urban cemetery. But the great thing being a nonprofit manager is we charge them through the nose. It's a great program for them. So it brings in about $250,000 a year, literally in cash every January. So,
wow.
Just to put it in perspective, it costs about $125,000 a year just to mow the yard here.
My goodness.
It's a great source of revenue, and they're also our eyes and ears in the cemetery. We don't have vandals and kids drinking and taking over headstones. So you will see dogs here 24/7.
That's fascinating. I'm just going to take a little kind of panoramic view here. It's such a kind of perfectly late October day. You can also just see that despite this cemetery, it's 25 acres, is that right?
35 acres.
35 acres.
Yep, 35 acres.
35 acres. It's right in the middle of the city, though. It's so cool. I mean, it just kind of feels like you're secluded here, but you're right in the middle of the city, so it's pretty cool. Now, is Laura's tomb right over here? Or... So she's really close to more of the Benjamin Latrobe cenotaphs, right between them.
Yep, that's Laura.
Okay, so we have Laura's. Now, this is not an original headstone. And we don't know, I think I couldn't find any records on when Laura's gravestone was, the new one was added. But you can kind of see her here. She's a little bit far away from, about 2-minute walk, I'd say, from Henry Clay's cenotaph. But why was she buried here? Well, we kind of want to think about the fact that this was, again, a up to 3-week journey to Washington, D.C. from Kentucky. So even though Henry and Lucretia were here in Washington, D.C., they could not take her home to bury her, where most of the rest of the family is buried at the Lexington Cemetery. I have a quote, an excerpt from a letter that Henry Clay wrote to Thomas Morris, who was from Ohio. And he's kind of explaining why they haven't been able to communicate about an accident that Thomas Morris had undergone. So here's the quote from Henry Clay. "At any time, it would have greatly distressed us, and at this particular moment would have been particularly affecting, but for your assurances that Thomas has nearly recovered. I hope you are not deceived in this respect. Owing to a recent source of painful affliction in our family, Mrs. Clay's mind is unusually sensible to danger, and I pray you to communicate anything you can which may tend to tranquilize it." So he's asking for kind words to be sent to Lucretia Clay. Henry and Lucretia had 11 children. Henry would bury 7 of the children, and Lucretia would bury an 8th. So they dealt with a great deal of loss over the course of their marriage. Now, Laura was only 3 to 4 months old when she passed away. So this is incredibly painful, and we just think about her, Lucretia being away from her family, being away from her home when this tragedy struck. But it was a tragedy that unfortunately they were very familiar with. So just kind of wanted to share that story with you all today. Paul, do you have anything else you'd like to share about the cemetery where people can find out more information?
Yeah, sure. We're run by a nonprofit now. We're still a private cemetery, but we're run by a nonprofit. So it's congressionalcemetery.org. And people always ask if you have to be rich and famous to be buried here, like the Clays. You don't. Our tagline is, you just have to be dead.
That's fantastic. That's great. That's great news for us common folk. So this is a really fantastic cemetery. It's, cemeteries are a great resource for genealogists, for historians who are interested in learning about the past. And you can always just find something kind of fascinating. Paul showed me a headstone just a few minutes ago. I should have shown it. That looked like a library card. It was for somebody who works at the Library of Congress who's not yet passed, right?
Right.
So are there other kind of creative headstones here on the property?
Yeah, we always encourage people to get creative. Design your headstone before you die, because when you die, your children are going to spend that money and go on a cruise and not buy a $10,000 headstone. So design the headstone you want, get creative, put some stuff on it about yourself, so that 100 years from now, when we are here discussing you, and we will talk about you after you're gone, we can figure out who you are. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Fantastic. Yeah, that's a really good public service announcement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we always say you can build as high as you can afford. So go for it.
That's right. That's right. Well, Paul, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This has been really illuminating, and I hope that when people come to Washington, they can kind of check these things out. When, we've got some visitors who come to DC. I know we're kind of closed here to everybody but the dog walkers right now because of the pandemic. So actually, to our viewers at home, this is kind of a special treat because not everybody's getting to see this. But I think you do have some virtual tours on your website.
Virtual tours online. So visit the website and you can literally walk around the cemetery from your own chair.
Oh, that's so cool. So check out congressionalcemetery.org.
Yep.
And you can find some excellent virtual tours of the cemetery. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for joining us at home. We hope that you have a very safe weekend. And we'll see you next week. I think Eric's going to be leading Wake Up with Ashland next week. So thank you all so much and have a great weekend.